Hey everybody, this is the first video in a 6-part mini-series on composing and patching with purpose. The idea for these videos came from conversations I've been having with my Patreon members, as well as some of the comments in these videos. So please keep those coming. I really love the back and forth to flesh out ideas. So I often hear about 2 common problems or challenges that people have when making music with the sound studio, or actually kind of modular in general. Number 1 is that some people noted that they often make sounds or just jam, and frequently in terms of the subharmonicon, they say things like, I'm just twisting knobs until I find something that sounds cool. The second problem that I hear a lot is that they're not producing anything. So there's a lot of jam sessions that just kind of go on endlessly, and that they don't come up with finished tracks that you could put out an album or something like that. So right from the get-go, I want to be clear that there's absolutely nothing wrong with making music that way. It's totally okay to approach making music from an experimental and exploratory perspective. It's also okay never to actually produce an album or any finished tracks. There are definitely not any rules to follow, and I don't think it necessarily makes sense to put those types of expectations on yourself if you don't feel like that's something you want to do. But with all that said, I find it really empowering to have a process or a framework to intentionally create something that I can fall back on if I'm ever feeling like in a rut or something. So that's what we're doing. I'm going to show you one way that you could intentionally and purposefully approach creating music with the sound studio or with modular to produce finished pieces of music. And while I'm going to use the sound studio to talk about my ideas in these videos, they're not exclusive to the sound studio. You could apply this to modular or really just any type of music, jazz, folk, whatever. So that's what this series is about, and here's how it's going to go down. In this video, episode 1, I'm going to talk about a framework for analyzing music by breaking music down into essential elements and principles. So I just want to give a little disclaimer here for all the other music theory nerds like myself who are out there kind of cringing a little bit. What I'm presenting to you now are my own ideas. I was taught some things in college, and if you Google them, you'll find lots of theory about the elements of music. I've kind of put all of those theories into my own framework, and that's what I'm presenting to you. So after this episode, there'll be 5 subsequent episodes. Episodes 2 through 6 will be applying that framework to the sound studio. In each episode, we'll create a finished piece of work, and after all is said and done, I'll put it out as an EP on Bandcamp so you can kind of hear how these pieces of work come together in the context of a complete album. Before I get into the elements and principles of music, let me just give you a quick pitch about my Patreon page. Not only did the idea for this video series come from my Patreon members, but the support of my Patreon members is what allows me to keep this channel moving and growing. I'm not a big channel, but I got some pretty big ideas, and I really couldn't do it without the support of my Patreon members. On Patreon, you can find patch books with Patreon exclusive videos. I'm going to put all of the patches that we create in this video series on there as well in PDF form. I'm also giving away modules that I build on a monthly basis. So if all that sounds interesting to you, great. If you like my content and you want to support me as a creator, I'd really appreciate it if you check it out and sign up. But okay, enough of that. Let's get into it. So music theorists will often break down music into essential elements. Many of these elements have overlap, and there are a few different schools around this and how important they are. These are things like melody, harmony, rhythm, etc. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and my perspective is a little bit different. I think it makes sense to group the elements not just in one grouping of elements, but to break it up and separate it into principles and elements. What's the difference? If you remember back in high school science, there was qualitative and quantitative data. Qualitative are things that you can't really measure, but you can describe in words, and quantitative are things that you can actually describe with numbers and very precise. Principles, in my opinion, are concepts or attributes of a piece of music that can be described using language, but are hard to objectively and precisely define. So it's how music feels. It's subjective, it can be interpreted differently, but it's also really important. Elements, on the other hand, are concepts or attributes of a piece of music that can be precisely defined or described. Something that you can notate. So something like a melody can be notated with notes, and rhythm can be notated as well. Those can be notated exactly, and it's not subjective at all. So there are principles that are overarching and probably vague, and then there are elements which are more like the building blocks and construction materials of the piece of music. So that's my current thought around this. It might change over time, but I'm going to talk about it as there are 3 essential principles of music, and there are 5 essential elements of music. I'd of course love to hear your thoughts on it and your perspective in the comment section. These ideas are fluid, and music is an art, not a science, so definitely chime in, let me know what you think. But here are the principles from my perspective. Number 1, tonality. This is the overall feel of music. So we would use words to describe it like dark or happy, sad, melancholy, nostalgic, those types of things. Now, all of those feelings that I'm describing the tone with, those are going to impact all of the elements we use to create that tonality. Number 2 is texture. So the words I would use to describe texture would be like soft, hard, abrasive, smooth, heavy, light, things like that. And again, the elements are what we use to create those textures. Timbre. Most often, I think this is used to describe the quality of specific instruments. And this was one that I really thought a lot about because we have so much control with synths, specific waves and things like that, that you can actually probably notate it. So it kind of contradicts what I was saying earlier. But most of the time, even though you might use a specific wave that you can actually document, there's still variations with it. And overall, when you're describing the timbre of a particular synth, you would use things like warm or fuzzy or things like that. So you would use words to describe it rather than like, this pulse is, etc. scientific-y stuff. So timbre is the quality of the instruments that you're using together with texture and tonality that creates an overall principle. There were some other principles I was thinking about adding, like energy and things like that, but whatever. I think that these 3 kind of sum up everything that we need to for this specific purpose of videos. So what are the elements? The elements are the things that we're going to use to sort of build up our sound. And there's overlap between them, but they impact each other. Number 1, there's rhythm. So this, in this context, is going to include things like tempo, gate lengths, sequence lengths, Euclidean rhythms, polyrhythms, things like that. Melody, of course, melody is kind of dictated by the decisions we make on the tonality and what notes we choose from, but it's also like rises and falls, stepped or chopped melodies, and things like that. The next element is harmony. Now this one is also kind of interesting in the context of modular and synths. Typically when I think about harmony, it's supporting sounds. So it could be to complement the melody or provide tension to it, something like that. The harmonic structure of the composition is going to increase the impact of the melody. It's interesting when you get into synths and modular because we often have multiple sequences going at the same time, and that kind of makes me think about counterpoint, where you almost have multiple melodies happening at the same time to create a harmonic structure. So we're going to look into that at some point, but I just want to put it out there that, there's of course some overlap between these things. Dynamics. Now we're talking about how loud or soft something is. And this is another one that it was like, is this a principle or is it an element? And part of the reason I struggle with that is because I think it's important to expand the concept of dynamics to include other attributes like busyness or how dense or sparse a piece of music is. So there can be a lot of overlap with texture and things like that. But I think it's important to include it in the elements because we're going to use it as a building block. And then the last element is form. So this is the overall structure or an arrangement of the different parts of the music. Pop music has very obvious forms where it's like intro, verse, chorus, bridge, chorus type thing. With modular and the Sound Studio, you could certainly do that. If you're using the Sound Studio exclusively to sequence your piece, it becomes a little bit harder and you have to get really creative about how to change the form. But we're gonna talk about that too as we go. So how am I gonna use these principles and elements to create music? So what I wanna do is make a plan using the principles for an overarching song, then go through methodically through the elements and make choices that support that initial plan. Make purposeful choices. And as we go through that, we'll create a piece of music that fits our overall plan purposefully and produces a finished piece of music. So remember how there's gonna be 5 videos and 5 songs on the EP? Well, there are 5 elements. And so what I want to do is focus in on one of these elements in each video. Now, of course, you're going to have to consider all of them for each piece, but for the sake of exercise, we'll hone in on one for every piece. And that way, also, all 5 of the different pieces will sound very unique and distinct from each other. They'll be focused in their complexity. So if you watch all the videos, hopefully it'll spark some ideas going for you so that you can incorporate them into your own music. So that's an overview of how the next videos are gonna work. If this is something that interests you, make sure that you subscribe so that you get a notification of the upcoming videos. If you're watching from sometime in the future, then all of these videos will be linked in the description. I'll also link the EP on Bandcamp so you can check it out and hear what the final products are. Don't forget to check out my Patreon page so you can hear more about this kind of stuff. Thanks so much for watching and all your support, and I'll see you in the first video.